Give me 3 seconds.
Okay. My name is Bob McCoubrey. I was born and raised here in Winfield at that time, now Lake Country. We lived down on the highway just south of Winfield on a piece of property my parents bought following the Second World War. My dad was in the Navy and he was able to buy a piece of land under the Veterans Land Act. And they built a house and raised a family there. They moved here in 1946. I was born in 1950. Very soon after they arrived here, my father got very involved in the community. He served on his church board, on the Winfield Memorial Hall board, helped build that hall after the Second World War as a memorial to the veterans. He was on the Recreation Commission. He was involved with the school board and the Farmers Institute, which was the quasi-government of the day that did things like set up a garbage dump and those kinds of things. When regional districts were first formed in, I believe, 1964, they needed somebody to be appointed to the first board, and the members of the community who had been involved with all of the activities that happened here suggested my dad, John Nicholson McCoubrey was his name. And then in the first elections, he was elected as the regional district director for Area A, which encompassed all of what is now Lake Country: Oyama, Carrs Landing, Okanagan Center, and Winfield. And he successfully kept that position until the day he died in 1978. So in the family history, we certainly talk about him being involved with the school board. As to whether he was actually a trustee or not, I know at that time school boards were changing, and I think it was just prior to him arriving, each community had its own school board around one school. And at that time, prior to that, high school students went to Oyama for high school, and by the time my oldest brother was eligible for high school, it had been amalgamated into School District 23, and he went to Rutland for school. And then they decided to build George Eliot in 1959. I think they started and opened in 1960 or 61. I think he was involved in those processes, but again, whether he was the trustee or not, I'm not sure.
Was your father a full-time farmer to begin with? So did he farm part-time and had another occupation?
Yes, he always had other work to support his farming habit. He really bought the farm for lifestyle. He thought it would be a great place to raise a family, and it turned out that was correct. But he always did other jobs. He worked for a while for Les Clement in the post office when it was in the old Winfield General Store, which became, what was his name? The secondhand store.
Yes, Curly's.
Curly's secondhand store, yeah. We buy junk and we sell antiques. He worked there for a while. He worked for the packing house in the field service in the season. He would work in the summer and not in the fall, gathering crop estimates and that kind of thing. And eventually ended up working in the packing house as their shipper and bookkeeper and the person who did all the manifests and all those kinds of things. And he did that until shortly before his death. So he was a farmer, but he was more a gentleman farmer. He hired most of the work out, and once we all got to be old enough to do the work, we were the ones who picked up prunings for 10 cents an hour and that kind of thing.
So from you graduating from high school, what then did you choose to go on with?
All right. When I left high school here, I went to Simon Fraser, and off and on over about 4 years, got partway through a degree in science, and eventually quit that and got married. Sharon and I married Sharon Motz, who was another local graduate of George Eliot. And we eventually bought the farm next door to my parents' place, and we farmed that for 35 years. until we sold it in 2011. During that time, I was involved with the community as well. Got involved with the irrigation districts, out on that board for 5 years or so. Was involved in the Community Complex Action Committee, which tried to get George Eliot turned into a shared use facility, and resulted in eventually the rebuilding of George Eliot, a much bigger facility. Community put money in. We went to referendum prior to incorporation and got the people of Area A to agree to raise money through taxes to build a theater. The final shakedown of the agreement was that the old gym transferred into the hands of the community, along with half of the foyer and the theater, and then the rest of the building belongs to the school district. Now, it's all located on school district land, so it basically is one facility. But if it wasn't for that input of money from the municipality, it wouldn't have happened. At least we wouldn't have had a theater, and it's a great, great facility.
So from there, married and bought your land. What was your occupation and children that you had with Sharon?
Well, similar to my father, I had many different jobs that supported my farming habit. I was a little more involved in the actual farm than my dad had been. I did my own pruning and thinning and spraying and all of those kinds of things. But I always needed outside work. So over the years, I drove a fuel truck for one winter. I inspected fruit for a couple of years for the federal government in the packing houses to make sure they were up to standards. I just did whatever it took in order to get things going. But there's no question that my wife's profession as a teacher and eventually a professor at the university supported me in my lifestyle. During that time, we farmed conventionally for 15 years and then switched over to organic production in 1989, and I got quite involved with the organic community as well. During that time, we raised 2 children, Sarah and Patrick, who both went through school here at George Eliot, and was typical at the time, left town just as soon as they could to get an education and find careers elsewhere.
And their occupations?
Sarah, she's trained as a lawyer. She is a consultant now in the field of access to justice, and she works in Canada but also in other countries, helping them to develop systems that make justice and the legal system available to their citizens. Patrick lives in Victoria and works for the Capital Regional District in the watershed, looking after the forest that provides the water for the Greater Vancouver or Greater Victoria area. And he also has given us a granddaughter, which was a good thing. My parents, John and Pat McCoubrey, raised their family. There was 3 of us, 3 boys. My oldest brother David had been born in Sydney, Nova Scotia, and moved here with them after the war. My other brother Ross was born here, and so was I. All of us went to school here at George Eliot, Winfield Elementary before that. Both of them left after high school, and my brother joined the Navy, David joined the Navy, and Ross became a teacher up in the Caribou, where he still lives. I think we can stop.
So Colin, what do you
Yeah, I think we need to get some questions back and forth there. I
Sure.
think the thing about the incorporation and all of that kind of stuff should flow out of that comment that he was the regional district director.
Okay.
So being the regional district representative for our area, the first one, your father, John McCoubrey, there were all kinds of challenges that he had to work with and so on. And do you have any history or stories of that time and that era?
Well, certainly in the time that he was on the regional district board, there were many activities that or services that were brought into the area through the regional district. Things like streetlights. In those days, every time a street light was put up, it had to be added to the tax roll as a separate item. So often our tax bills would say 6 cents that goes towards the light at the corner of Beaver Lake Road and Highway 97. One of the main things that was built, that was in process when the city of Kelowna went into a forced expansion by the NDP government of the day, was the arena and curling rink, which was under construction at the time. All of that had been arranged through a referendum, and the people of the area had agreed to pay for it. Some of the tax base that was paying for this ended up being given to the city of Kelowna, the area that we refer to as the industrial area, that is still a sore point for a lot of people because it was industrial taxation that shifted from Area A to the city of Kelowna. So that was in the works, along with the senior center, which had, I don't know if construction had started, but there was certainly discussion about it, and we were counting on that tax base to pay for it. When the province came along to Kelowna and said, you're going to take right up to Beaver Lake Road, of course, Hiram Walker was the big tax base that was down in that area at the time, and the local people here said, well, that's no good. That's not going to work because then we won't be able to afford to pay for our arena. So at that time, my dad went to Victoria and had a meeting with Jim Lorimer, who was the Minister of Municipal Affairs at the time, and said, you know, this is not going to work. If Kelowna gets our tax base, we just won't be able to complete the arena. And the minister said to him at the time, don't worry, John, it won't happen. I won't let that happen to you. So he flew back to Kelowna, and when he got off the plane, he picked up the Daily Courier, and the headline was basically Beaver Lake Road was going to be the boundary. So it had been done before he had gone into the meeting. He always had a very low opinion of provincial politicians after that. The deal that was worked out was that for the period of the mortgage on the arena, I believe it was $55,000 a year, was contributed by the city of Kelowna to Lake Country or to Area A to cover that cost. At the same time, fire protection, which had been established in Winfield and separately in Oyama before we were a municipality, they realized that the best provision of fire protection in the Hiram Walker area would have been the District of Lake Country's or the Area A's fire protection districts. So similarly, a deal was struck that went into the incorporation or the expansion agreement that said Kelowna would pay a certain amount to the fire protection district in order to provide that first response. When we incorporated as a municipality, those agreements came over to the new municipality until the arena ran out. I think it was a 20-year deal, so that would have been about 1993, I guess, which is just before incorporation. The fire provision, I believe, is still in place, where it's a part of a mutual aid agreement, and money does come from the Kelowna tax base for that. So those were the kinds of things that he worked on as a regional district director. The introduction of zoning into Area A happened under his watch, and that was a very contentious issue from sort of the cowboys, from the pioneer mentality who didn't want anyone telling them what to do, and it got quite acrimonious. But in the meantime, I think we all accept that zoning is just a good thing, and particularly now with marijuana coming in, municipalities are struggling with how to deal with those contentious issues, and without zoning that wouldn't have been possible.
For raising funds for the Winfield Hall, do you have a story to tell us?
Well, it's not a first-hand story because I wasn't born yet, but as I understand it, when the veterans came back from the Second World War and it was decided to build a new community hall, they needed to fund it, and of course there was no local government to raise taxes and all those kinds of things. So one of the things that happened, most of the people who lived in the community were either farmers or people who supported the farming community. Farmers would donate apples, boxes, it was before bins, so it would have been boxes of apples that would then be sold, and that would go to the hall board to finance the construction. And I don't know all of the details, but I do know that that happened, and a lot of farmers who maybe didn't have any cash felt that they could give a certain number of boxes of apples, and that helped to finance a great facility which served the community now for 70 years, 75 years, something like that, and is still serving it well.
Now, I would be interested to hear more about the Winfield Memorial Hall.
So the hall was built, it was basically bare bones at the beginning. There was an old, I think a sawdust burning furnace down in the basement in the area that's under the stage now. And it was very rustic. All they were concerned about was having a functional space to have community activities. And then as time went on, certainly the hall board has done a great job of finishing it off. But in those early years, up above the two sides of the hall, it was open to a balcony, and when a dance happened, they would have tables all in the balcony, and people would look over the edge and watch the dancers down on the floor, and it would be packed. It was just one of the only things there was to do in the area was to go to dances, so everybody got to know each other by going to these community functions. When I was probably 15 in 1965 or so, George Eliot was able to host the provincial volleyball championships. And at that time, they approached the hall and said, we need another gym facility. Can we put some effort into making the hall suitable for volleyball and basketball? So portable backboards were put in place that folded up out of the way. And then for volleyball, they just used the two side walls to hold the net. And hosted all of these teams from Vancouver and more sophisticated places who came and were just amazed at what a small community could do. That would have, in '65, that would have been real cooperation between the school board and the school, which again had teachers and the principal, Peter Gurr at the time, very strong community member. That whole ethic of small town demonstrated itself at the community hall and other places. Another example, in those days, the school didn't have a track, so they formed a society called the probably Winfield Back the Track Society. So people bought bonds from the society with the full understanding they would never cash them in. And then the money went to the community to build a cinder track in front of George Eliot, where the parking lot is now. So as a small school, the year I graduated, there were 176 students in grades 8 to 12. There were 17 of us, I think, 20 of us in our grad class. So we're a very small school, but we had facilities that you wouldn't normally have in such a small school, and part of that was because small rural communities step up to the plate. And I'm sure that happened in many other communities in BC, but we got to experience that one. So farming was always my main occupation, although I always needed other things to supplement my income. And some of it was done out of interest. Certainly getting involved in local government was something that interested me, and I really enjoyed that time. But I didn't make enough money from the farm. Once we went organic, our income increased. It got to the point where I thought it should be. We were paid fairly for our product. And then I got involved with the organic community as well, at the local level and at the provincial level, a little bit at the federal level.
So do you have organic gardens now today?
Well, everything we do would meet organic standards, but because we're just growing for ourselves, we're not certified, but we still don't use the pesticides that would have hindered our certification. I am involved with a nonprofit that grows food for social service agencies, and we also run an incubator farm where prospective new farmers can give farming a try by getting access to land, sharing equipment and getting advice from seasoned farmers. And we do all of that under the rules of organic status. However, we haven't certified those lands. But we do everything. I mean, once you're into organic farming, you understand the principles, and the principles are all about keeping biodiversity alive and making sure that the soil is better than it was when you started, and all those kinds of things. So once you believe in that, then that's what you continue to do. So in, probably about 1990, we first started to explore the idea of incorporating as a municipality in Area A. We went through 2 referendums before it was passed. I can't remember all the details about the first one and why it didn't go, but I think a lot of people were afraid their taxes would go up and were used to the rural atmosphere. I myself got involved because I didn't think it was a good idea. I didn't see that there was a need for it. But once we got into studying the issues and finding out who was responsible for what and who paid for what, all of those kinds of things, it became clearer and clearer that having our own elected people in control of our lives would have been a good thing. So finally in 1992, a referendum passed. The Ministry of Municipal Affairs in Victoria structured it in such a way that they would count the votes over the whole area, so all of the 4 communities, Okanagan Centre, Carrs Landing, Oyama, and Winfield, all of the votes would be put into one pool, and it was decided, the majority said yes. They also let it be known how each of those areas had voted, and as it turns out, 2 of them turned it down, and 2 of them approved it. And of course, Winfield had the bigger population and approved it, and so that carried the day. None of us on that committee wanted it to be structured that way. We wanted it to be structured so that if an area didn't want to join, they could opt out. But Victoria wouldn't let that happen. And then once the decision was made, you couldn't find someone from Victoria for love or money, and it fell on those of us who were there trying to set things up to deal with the people who were unhappy with the fact that they were included in incorporation. However, we rolled right along. I had got on the regional board in 1993 and was the regional director when incorporation happened, and that was on May the 5th, I believe it is, 1995, when we got our letters patent and had a ceremony in the hall where that was delivered to us. Once the referendum went through, the province hired Rod Drennan to be our first administrator. He operated out of a single room that was probably 8 feet by 8 feet in what is now the Italian restaurant on Barrie Road. That was an insurance real estate office at the time, and they sublet one room. That was our municipal office for the first 6 months or so. We very quickly started to hire people, and we needed to have space. We struck a deal with the school district, who had just shut down Woodlake Elementary School, and were waiting to decide what to do with the property. So we took over that building, revamped it a little bit, didn't spend very much money, and operated out of that building for a year or so. I ended up with the kindergarten room as my office. It had a little loft up top, which I thought was really good, so the mayor could have a bit of a nap in the middle of the afternoon. Shortly after that, we negotiated with the Lakewood Mall and set up our offices there for the balance of my time in office. I probably forgot to say I also ran for mayor in those first elections and was successful. Because I had been the regional district director, a lot of the people who were involved in delivery of service said, it just makes sense for you to take that on and provide continuity. So I was there for 5 years. By the time I left, we were still down in the mall, and shortly after that, they struck a deal with the hall board to buy a piece of property that the hall board had for expansion, and the municipal hall was built there. Okay. During that time, that would be from 1995 to 2000, when I was involved, we had lots of challenges. We were setting up a brand new municipality, so we had to hire all the staff. We had to deal with people who were used to only paying for part of their services under the provincial system, people who live in unorganized areas. The way we looked at it, we were either paying for our roads or we were paying for our police, but somebody else was picking up the tab for the other half. The transition was a complicated formula where the province gave us a lump sum of money to cover some of those costs, and they also eased our responsibility in over a period of time. Policing, for instance, we were already over the size where we were supposed to pay 70% of policing. They allowed that to be brought in over time. We were able to budget to build a reserve to ease that impact on the tax base as we took over responsibility. Roads, they gave us a lump sum and said, here you are, look after the roads. So we had to set up a roads department. Brian McCoubrey was our roads manager, who did a good job of taking the money that was available and the needs, because a lot of our roads were just old goat trails that had a bit of asphalt on top of them. It was a big challenge, and I think it remains a big challenge in how to deal with those issues. And that demonstrates really the logic in taking over control, is getting all of those decisions under one roof so that you're thinking about everything when you approve something, rather than saying, sure, you can subdivide a piece of land here, there's no sidewalks, but we don't care whether you have sidewalks or not. So we set up all of that, and that was quite challenging. We also had to for under orders from Victoria, we had to take over the irrigation districts. A lot of us who had been on irrigation boards felt that those bodies did a really good job of administering water, but we were told that was not an option. So that was challenging both operationally and politically, because there was hard feelings from some of the people who had been involved in each of the communities delivering water. Similarly, fire, we had 2 different fire departments, 2 different chiefs. They did, to their credit, got together and figured out how it would work under the new municipality. Since then, changes have been made with all of these structures. Some of the challenges that came along, the first one would be in planning. We looked at how development was starting to happen in all of Area A. And we started this actually before incorporation, where we looked at it and said, if we just allow the sort of rampant urbanization that had been happening prior to the Land Commission coming in, but it actually continued right up into incorporation, that we were going to have an unaffordable community. So we developed a thing we called urban containment, where we drew a line around an area and said all of the urban development has to happen within that boundary. Once that's built out, then we can talk about expanding it, and then taking into account the fact that some of the land was protected by the Agricultural Land Commission. So that took quite a bit of work to set that up. We hired consultants and had our own planning staff who worked on that, and I think we did a good job. Some of that is still in place, some of it has been abandoned in the meantime, but that's the reality of municipal politics. Another huge challenge we had was the need for sewer. All of the area on the flats here that runs along the flat of the valley right into Wood Lake, septic tanks were basically putting raw sewage or raw effluent into the water table, and it was showing up in Wood Lake. And for years, many of us didn't swim in Wood Lake anymore because the south end was polluted. And then the Clearwater subdivision up on the east slope of the valley, the health people were telling us that when those septic fields failed, what was really happening is this effluent was hitting hard pan and sliding down into the valley. So they were really keen to have us set up a sewer system. We went through a number of attempts to set something up. At that time, P3s, public-private partnerships, were the rage, and we looked into that, tried to get a a company out of Vancouver that was associated with Inland Gas at the time, which is now part of BC Gas, I believe, or Fortis, who wanted to provide our sewer system for us. And we kept looking at the numbers and going back and forth. We had a great treasurer at the time in Steve Banham. He was able to analyze their figures and find that the reason they really wanted us was that they were charging an interest rate that was something like 13% on any balance that we hadn't paid off from before. And because we had so few hookups to start with, all it did is just increase that huge amount of capital debt, and would have been a gold mine for them. When we figured out what they were really proposing, we said, we'll do the financing, you build the system, and they quickly left town and were not interested. So we ended up building a sewer system. In order to pay for it, we had to bring in the $75 environmental tax, which was very controversial at the time. A lot of people who weren't going to be on sewer said, why should I pay $75 every year for a system that benefits people in another area? And our approach was that everybody uses the lakes. Keeping the lakes clean was really important, not only for our community, but for Vernon and Kelowna, who are downstream from us. So we got grants from the Okanagan Basin Water Board, from the province, and a huge subsidy from the taxpayers of Lake Country through the environmental levy, which I believe is still on our taxes. Then in addition to that, people who actually hooked up paid for hookup, and they paid the monthly service. So that I see that as a huge positive that happened during the time that I was there, in that we were able to come to grips with a really important problem that was out there. Another thing that happened during that time was the rebuilding of George Eliot as a shared use facility, and that I guess the credit for that I would put to John Madsen, who chaired the committee, was a very politically astute, but also just a very understood bureaucracies. And John had a saying that he would use when we were all meeting. He would say, you know, it's amazing what you can get done if you don't care who gets the credit. And that was the kind of guy John was. He made things happen, but he never stood up in front and said, I'm the guy who did this. And it was a joint effort between parents, teachers, principals, the school district, the municipality, and eventually we got approval to rebuild it, and now we have this great facility.